evening, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. Very grateful to everyone for being here today on a very, very special evening. We're hosting for the very first time in Pakistan House a talk by a very famous Pakistani artist whose name is Faiza Butt, whom you have also met briefly in the other room. So, I feel very honored to introduce a great artist, a female artist from Pakistan, who's actually based out of the UK. She has been living there for a while and is internationally recognized, renowned, and known for her work. The short time that we had in terms of setting up this presentation and talk, we could not bring her work to Prague. We are working to do that, and hopefully, inshallah, we hope that we will be able to bring her work to Prague and maybe in some of the famous galleries here. Prague is a capital, you know, that needs no introduction when it comes to art, literature, architecture, culture, etc. So when I go around and meet with people, we can talk very easily, I find, with my Czech counterparts on several subjects, but Pakistani art is a subject that people are not very familiar with. So we are actually very good at it, Faiza, but we have not maybe done a good job of presenting it to several countries, including the Czech Republic. Faiza's work has already been shown in several of the famous galleries of the world, and she will talk a bit more about it. Her work is currently being shown at Venice Biennale as well, and in addition to that, several other places. She draws her inspiration from not only our own cultural heritage, but the cultural heritage of Central Asia and of the entire region. So without much further ado, I'd ask Faiza to introduce more of her work and her presentation, which I have had the opportunity of briefly looking at, and it is quite amazing. And I'm sure today we'll learn much more than we have maybe in our past interactions about what Pakistani art really is, contemporary work, and work of famous and world-acclaimed artists like Faiza herself. Thank you, Faiza, for being here, and I'm sure we're in for a treat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I must remind you one thing, that artists are makers. They're not talkers. I do not prepare a speech. I do not look at content and deliver it to you. I will talk from the heart and from the mind, and I think that's when people enjoy it most. That's my experience. Before I start my conversation, I want to reinforce one point. I want you to take a moment and realize the power of the image. The camera has only been around since last 200 years. Imagine a world before camera, when image is something that you only have access to. If you're invited to the Grand Cathedral, you can come to the Mughal court, or you're aristocratic enough to commission art and other luxuries. So image is something very exclusive. Why is it exclusive? Because image carries immense power to influence people, to create an impression or to convey knowledge, which is a domain of power and control. So most of the history of fine art, as we understand it, has been dedicated to faith. So either it was dedicated to faith, to create a tangible image of God through stained glass windows, through sculptures of God, or through manuscripts like Quran. Or it was the domain of the aristocratic, who can represent themselves through exalted images of themselves and their lifestyle. So what we uses the word propaganda and art have always been in bed. But having said that, art is natural to us as breathing. Everyone's born an artist. All children draw, but it stemmed out of us eventually in one form or the other. Okay, without further ado, I'll start there. I've titled my conversation Memory and Metaphor because memory is a very important resource for the artist. Most creative activities are rooted in memory. Memory is a filing system. What we keep at the front is for survival, what goes at the back is life and time in general. Memory and metaphor means symbolic value of something. Art is a medium of communication. It uses symbolic ways and means to communicate something which cannot be said through words. So when you can say something through words, you don't draw it. It was very interesting for me. First of all, I love the iconic quality of the face as the central form in that work. But on the right side, I have something which was a very personal experience. I made this work during the Iraq War, and I was looking at prisoners that were taken after the war has kind of cooled off, and there were a lot of Iraqis that were put into the prisons. And their faces were presented in the papers as mug shots. And a mug shot is a very scary thing. It's a very scientific, dehumanizing photograph of a culprit. The interesting thing is, the mug shot strips person of their identity. When our face is put into a frame centrally, anyone can look like a criminal. But if you, for example, if you look at the politicians, their photographs are quite often in a context. They're not looking straight at us, they're talking, they're delivering something very important to us. But when a person's face is put straight into the image, they look guilty. So I started looking at the works of bearded men, Muslim men, whose faces were presented in mugshots, as an act of sympathy where the man stares out at us. And these collection of images were very interesting because these men were innocent and their mugshot was influencing us. So I started looking at the power of photography, the power of cultural framing. So these works were an example of that. But miniature, the interesting thing with Persian miniature is that it relates to the Chinese painting. So there are certain motifs that travel through Chinese painting, into the Persian painting, into the Mughal, and then they go out towards the Ottomans. So that pollination of culture is very, very interesting. And I want to remind you at this moment that culture is the most polluted territory. Culture is never pure. Culture is not a fossil. Culture enjoys technology, benefits from it, then gives it back. And these paintings are a very good example of the regional pollination. So as you can see, there are certain elements that I pick out from it, which are decorative elements or compositional elements. And I use, most of my work comes from photography. So my work is very much in the contemporary realm where it looks at the past, but where it consumes what's present. So this is slightly political. This is Rudy Giuliani on the cover of Times. And the interesting thing was his smile was really interesting. He's had fake teeth, obviously, so the smile was not real. And I thought that there's enough context there to work with. So what I do is I quite often work with eyes, enhancing them or removing them. They say that eyes are the window to the soul. Eyes are our eye contact is our first introduction to the person. And eyes, you take away eyes, that black strip, it takes away your identity. So for me, the mushroom clouds are the ultimate symbol of the tragedy of war, and they quite often come in my work, so it's all symbolic. He had like a comedy tie on or something, so instead of that, I had like the rubbish in there as a decorative element. Didn't paint, I told you, I never painted because going to Slade made me reject Western tradition of painting. But during COVID time, I forgave painting. In COVID time, I was angry all the way till COVID happened, and I asked myself, why did I want to be an artist? And I realized I wanted to paint. But some kind of intense cultural experiences made me like a warrior, reactionary artist. So what I did was, I went to the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square, and I also was reading a lot about the Shinocery tradition, the Dutch pollination with India, how the oil painting, the golden age, the contribution of interacting with the East, how did this all happen? And I started painting here. And I started painting my children who were in very classically arranged, like the tradition of portrait painting from the sort of 19th century. But they are constantly attached to some device, because this was my grand reality, the existence in the virtual world, especially during COVID times. So they are presented like historic paintings. Because when you go to Frieze Art Fair, there's so much fear towards past. Because we have to move forwards, we have to be so angsty, you have to look modern. Quite often people go and see contemporary art, they don't understand it, they are belittled by it. So it's very important for me that my work is democratic. Somebody gets something out of it. And I felt that painting does that. It really warms up to people. It's called Farewell Eunomia, and my daughter is staring up like a goddess in the distance, but there's a grand tragedy happening at the back, like the beginning of some meteoritic crash.